presents the Premium Oddscast, your home for the best fight picks, bets, analysis, and statistics, hosted by mixed martial arts oddsmaker Nick Kalikas, fight scientist and author of Fightnomics Kuhn, and myself, MMA journalist Brian Hemminger. Get an inside track from the experts as part of MMAOddsbreaker.com's premium betting service. Welcome, everyone, to Part 1 of the Premium Oddscast presented by 5 Dimes. I'm Brian Hemminger, and I'll be joined today by professional MMA line setter Nick Kalikas and MMA statistics guru Kuhn to break down this Saturday's UFC on Fox 10 event. Before we get to that, let's bring you up to speed on the totals from UFC Fight Night 35 last Wednesday. Our premium plays went 1-2 overall, losing 2 parlays that unfortunately included Charlie Brenneman and Albus Killick, while our straight bet on Elias Silveria was a winner. Overall, though, we ended up losing 2.95 units, our first losing event since the formation of the new MMA Oddsbreaker premium team. I'd be remiss if I also didn't mention our free play for World Series of Fighting 8, a 2-unit bet suggestion on Tyson Nam, which also failed to cash. Say what you want about the judges, but at the end of the day, we didn't come through, and we'll work to get better in that department. Back to the present, UFC on Fox 9 takes place this Saturday, January 25th at the United Center in Chicago, Illinois, and the main card will air on Big Fox. The event will feature 11 fights in total. Now, opening up the UFC on Fox 10 preliminary card is a heavyweight matchup featuring a pair of guys who are both 0-1 after their UFC debuts, and Walt Harris, who is 6-2 overall, taking on Nikita Krylov, who is 15-3. Now, Nick, where'd you open this fight, and how has the public shifted things?
Well, Harris opens -260, Krylov +180, and the public overall betting action has shifted things up for Harris, actually. He is now sitting at 5 Dimes at -4-1, so -400 for Harris, and the comeback currently +310 for Krylov. A little bit insane because these guys, honestly, neither one of them are really proven, and they are both barely UFC level. I mean, the UFC, I've said it time and time again, at the heavyweight division, let's face it, let's be honest, I mean, it's probably one of the weakest divisions in the entire organization. So these guys are barely UFC level fighters, in my opinion, and both coming off UFC debut losses, and both struggle a little bit at times, especially Krylov. I guess I'll start off with him a little bit. On the feet, I mean, he's not really a striking-based fighter. He kind of looks to take the fight to the floor a little bit more so. I mean, he has some strikes. Nothing too outstanding, though. I mean, he throws some hands, mixes in some kicks, pulls out a jab, looking to basically set up his strikes to get the fight to the floor. On the floor, he's not bad. He has some decent ground and pound. He looks for control, looks for top position, and he'll try to get you in some sub trouble as well. So the submission aspect of Krylov's game is what he looks for and what he's good at. Cardio is a huge concern with Krylov, as evident. I mean, he obviously in his debut fight against Palele, he slowed down considerably. That's one of the reasons I think he lost that fight. But he does have a little bit of power, and he does have a little bit of experience, I guess, even in considering some of that experience is not so great on paper as far as opponent history for Krylov. But that being said, on the other side of it, Harris has only had 7 fights. And, again, he's coming off of a loss in the UFC as well. He looked a little bit better in his debut, but another thing that he did as well is fade as the fight went on. So for him on the feet, he is a southpaw, so he's going to have a little bit of advantages there. He has pretty good boxing. He's more athletic. He's an athlete, has a lot of power. But again, he just doesn't have much experience. He tends to fade as the fight goes on a little bit. He's a little bit inactive, a little bit too inactive for my liking at times. But he does have big power, especially in his straight left hand. Cardio, though, again, is a concern with this guy. So grappling, his athleticism helps in that realm a little bit. So he has decent ground and pound, decent takedown defense, especially early on. But as he gasses, you can definitely take him to the floor. So that's a concern, I think, with Harris here. This fight, you know, back and forth it goes, I think, but you got to give the slight edge to Harris. I think he should be able to keep the fight upright enough that it'll probably land and finish Krylov at some point. That's what my head tells me, so that's what I'm going to go with. But I don't know how you can confidently bet this fight either way, to be honest with you out there. It's just a crazy fight. I do expect it not to hit the cards, though, that's for sure, because these guys are just so unconditioned as heavyweights. I really think it's going to finish inside the distance, put it that way. So Harris is my pick, but you can't really confidently pick this fight.
what a slop fest with this fight. I was actually there for Krylov's UFC debut at UFC 164. It was one of the worst debuts I've ever seen, one of the funniest fights I've ever watched. Krylov, he's fought 18 times in 18 months, but it's crazier than that. He started fighting in July of 2012, and he fought 17 times in his first 9 months. That's ridiculous. And he was just repeatedly going in there against trash guys in Europe, just taking on whoever he could, and worked his way up to a UFC spot in a really quick amount of time. But he is so sloppy. He legitimately needs a lot more seasoning. You can tell that he hasn't even fought for a year and a half yet, like, in total. So his cardio looked terrible. His first 17 fights all finished inside the first round, whether he got finished or he finished them. So the second they went to the second round and third round against Soa Paleli, he looked awful. So that's his side of things. Harris, he's 30, and he was a big guy for getting, the quick finishes, getting the really brutal knockouts. But, he's so sloppy. He's got a lot of power, but he just would overwhelm guys. I mean, it wasn't pretty watching him fight. There's so much that he has wrong. But, I mean, he is a pretty good athlete. He was a basketball player at Jacksonville State, transitioned to MMA after his basketball career was over. Even in his fight against Jared Rosholt, I mean, he hurt Rosholt with a big punch early, but he just could not follow up on it. I mean, he can be taken down, but I don't think Krylov is the type of fighter that is good enough to put him on his back. So Harris is really sloppy, but he's a lot more dangerous than Krylov. And as we saw in that last fight, man, Krylov just scares the daylights out of me. I cannot believe he got a second fight in the UFC after that first performance. So I'm picking Harris, but those odds are ridiculous. So I think Harris wins, but there's no reason to bet him whatsoever here. So moving on, we have a pair of UFC debuters. We've got George Sullivan coming in with a 14-3 record in the welterweight division, the CFFC welterweight champ, taking on Mike Rhodes out of Rufus Sport, who is 6-1 overall, and he was the RFA welterweight champ. So, Nick, what's the Oddsmaker's perspective on this one?
Now, unlike the first fight we were just talking about, this fight I'm definitely excited for because both of these guys do belong making their debuts in the UFC, especially at welterweight. These guys are two exciting additions, two fighters that really like to stand and bang, two fighters that can dish out punishment, can absorb punishment, and in all likeliness is going to provide a fight of the night candidate for all of us here. Rhodes, starting off with him, of course. He has some experience on Access TV fights, some RFA shows and that sort of thing, and he's looked fantastic. I mean, the guy, he had a setback against Brandon Thatch. Obviously, most of us know what Thatch has done since he made his UFC debut. He's been a beast. So that's his only real setback. And you know what? I think he looked impressive in that fight up until a certain point. And then looking beyond that, though, I think Rhodes is just looked better and better. I mean, his striking is really solid. He's really fast for 170. He moves well. He's always on the balls of his feet using angles. He has really good boxing. Nice lead leg kicks. I mean, that's one thing that I've noticed as well. Working with the Rufus camp in general, his striking is going to be legit. And it is, really. I mean, it's impressive. He's fun to watch. He has tremendous KO power. And he's got good grappling, surprisingly, for a striking-based fighter. I mean, you could definitely tell that he's been drilling with Ben Askren and crew over at Rufus Sport because his takedowns are getting better. His takedown defense is getting better. And his ground savviness overall is really solid. So I think he's a solid prospect. I mean, he's young. He has a lot of room to grow, and I think he's going to continue to improve. So I really like Mike Rhodes overall, and I think he's going to make some waves at 170. Now, getting into Sullivan, I mean, I just said all those good things about Rhodes, and Sullivan has a lot of those same attributes. I mean, the guy's, again, more well-known for his striking. He has long limbs. He's an orthodox striker that likes to throw basically some nice 1-2 combos, and he's got good timing with his counters as well. Has some power in his hands, but he doesn't exactly have the best boxing. If you look at him on footage, I mean, he's more of a counterpuncher. He backs up a little bit, uses some movement, but he's not really a fierce striker. It's weird with him because he has more power, I guess, than it looks. That being said, what the best attribute about him is his takedown defense and his ability to scramble and make you work. I mean, people try to take him down time and time again, and the guy, you can't put him on his back, but you struggle so much, and once you get him on the floor, he bounces right back up, and he's just one of these zombie type of fighters, man, like a Matt Horwich, for those of you guys know that who I'm referring to. Just one of those guys that keeps continuing to push forward. You can clip him with things, and he just will push a crazy pace, and usually wears you out to the point where most people will fold. And that's the kind of fighter he is. He has the power, then he takes control of the fight, and he tends to get a knockout or finish. He has 10 fights, obviously, by knockout on his resume, but it's not really that explosive knockout power. It's just kind of that grinding, kind of wearing pace that does tend to get to people after a while. Well, in this particular fight, though, against Rhodes, I don't think he's going to have that success. Rhodes is too tough for him. I think Rhodes is going to be able to pick him apart on the feet. It's going to probably remain on the feet because both these guys, their takedown defense and the wrestling will probably neutralize each other out, although I do give a little bit of an edge to Rhodes as far as pure wrestling goes. But Sullivan, unfortunately for him, he is tough as nails, but I just think he's going to get outpointed in this fight. I do probably expect it to hit the cards because of how tough he is, but I expect Rhodes to win this fight. So I'm confidently picking Rhodes in this fight. I think he's just going to be too much for Sullivan.
Yeah, there's a stat that stands out to me. It's 8, and that's the year's age difference for these guys. Rhodes comes in 24 years old, the whole world ahead of him, and Sullivan, 32. So, not many guys can make their UFC debut, in their early 30s and then go on to have, great success unless your name is Randy Couture. So, I think that's a huge thing that stands out to me. Sullivan is a solid fighter, though. He trains with Kurt Pellegrino. He dominated the CFFC for 2 years. He has a really big right hand, and he's showcased that he can go the distance. He's got a lot of knockout power. And as you mentioned, he doesn't just look for the right hand. He does have a sneaky counter left hook that he does catch people with, and it does protect him when people are pushing the pace against him. He has okay ground skills, but obviously prefers to stand. The one thing that does concern me with him is he telegraphs his power shots. I mean, he literally winds back like he's pulling a slingshot and throws his right hand, and when it lands, it's nasty, like the Greg Soto knockout, the UFC vet, but it's very easily dodgeable, and I think that Rhodes is savvy enough that it won't be able to connect very often. Now, you look at Rhodes, trained out of Rufus Sport. You mentioned the only loss to Brandon Thatch, but, I mean, not just that. He took that fight on 10 days' notice. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt there. I think he could have given Thatch an even better fight if he actually had a full training camp and actually prepared for the guy. But Rhodes is a really good athlete. He's got some nasty power in his right hand. I mean, he can knock people out off of his back foot while moving backwards just with a short right hand. So that's something that stands out to me. I mean, the guy can hurt you in a whole lot of different ways and not just with the typical power setups. And I don't think cardio is going to be an issue whatsoever. I mean, he just had a 5-round showcase to win the RFA welterweight title against Alan Jaboin. So he looked really sharp in that fight, and he got the exposure. That was a headlining fight, so he's got some experience there. He had 3 RFA fights, those last 3 were some really big, important fights for him. And he's got a lot of room for growth. I mean, Anthony Pettis hyped this guy up and said that he's going to be the next Rufus guy in the UFC and he's going to make an impact. So it's time for him to deliver, and I think he will. So I expect him to outpoint, and Sullivan might be too tough for his own good. So we'll find out. But I think Rhodes is going to win this fight. He might get a knockout if he can wear him down over time. But, this should definitely be Mike Rhodes for me. Now, moving on, we have a very interesting lightweight contest featuring a pair of Ultimate Fighter 15 veterans in Darren Krookshank, who comes in with a 13-4 mark, taking on Mike Rio, who is 9-3 overall. Now, Nick, where'd you open this one, and how's Public shifted things with their bets?
Krookshank -210, the comeback on Rio +160. That was my opening line. And looking over at 5 dimes right now, it's -250 for Krookshank. So some movement towards Darren, and I can understand why. I mean, he's a popular fighter. Always seems to get a little bit of betting support. So, he did guarantee he lost a little bit of stock in his loss to Martins recently. He's bouncing off that, coming back from that loss, I should say. So this is an interesting fight here because Rio coming off 2 straight losses, so obviously he needs to win this fight. And it's basically your striker versus a grappler type of matchup. I mean, Krookshank, up until his last fight, or his last couple performances have been a little bit more questionable, but a lot of people believe that Krookshank was one of the best, or at least most unique strikers in the lightweight division. And that seemed to be the case. I mean, he moves well on the feet. He mixes things up with his boxing and his kicks well. He's got that karate type of style. He goes to the body well, so he could be effective with his power. There's a lot of good things about Krookshank, and he also has some decent wrestling to back it up in most cases. But that's the area where he's going to probably have a little bit of trouble with Rio here. Rio, obviously, he's okay on the feet, but that's not his strong suit at all. I mean, he's kind of flat-footed, but he does like to push forward. Again, he's not very good standing at all, but he comes in forward, swinging a little bit wild and aggressive at times. And it's basically, again, another one of these guys that uses his stand-up, Rio that is, to look for takedowns and utilizes grappling. So that's the game plan for Rio. He's going to try to be aggressive, I think, use his striking to set up some takedowns, push Krookshank up against the cage, and try to utilize his grappling advantage over Krookshank. Now, it's going to be hard to do, but this is where it makes things interesting. I know a lot of people are confidently betting Krookshank because they think his takedown defense and his wrestling should neutralize Rio's out, and on the feet he should have that big advantage, but I'm not sure. I think Rio, if he withstand some of the punishment on the feet, he can make this fight interesting enough where he could possibly get a few takedowns. And once he has Krookshank on the floor, I mean, his positional control is not bad. His ground and pound actually is not bad. And then, of course, he has an underrated submission game as well. So, interesting fight. Your typical, again, grappler versus striker battle. Usually you got to lean a little bit more with the grappler in this spot, but I'm going to go the other way, and you have to give the edge to Krookshank, I think, slightly here. But, again, it's another one of those probably not so confident spot because Krookshank has not looked the best recently. Rio is in a must-win spot, and it's a really strange fight. And the weakness of Krookshank being the ground and the strength of Rio obviously being the ground makes it even that more interesting. But Krookshank, more times than not, should bounce back, get the W here, and probably keep his spot in the UFC roster. So I'm going to pick Krookshank to win this fight.
And it is definitely the grappler versus striker. I mean, Krookshank has the big martial arts background. He was the Taekwondo guy, and he does throw some really nice kicks. I mean, he mixes it up to the body, to the legs, to the head. But what does scare me here is Krookshank does not push the pace very often. He likes to be that guy on the outside who's moving around, switching things up, looking for angles, looking to counter. And that could get him in trouble here because Mike Rio just wants to close the distance, get inside, get Krookshank on his back, and either lay and pray him or work some ground and pound, maybe find a submission if he can get it. I mean, Krookshank got tapped out with a Kimura/armbar attempt from Martin. So, I mean, it is possible to get this guy out if you get him on the canvas and get him in a bad spot. Krookshank is not very good off of his back. So that is something that does concern me. But, on the feet, Krookshank outclasses Rio so badly. Rio is just not very good at standing at all. He just kind of plods forward. I mean, you saw in the Tony Ferguson fight, he got lit up by Tony Ferguson. He got hurt real bad and then fell right into a Darce choke. So there's a very good chance that if this fight stays standing, that Krookshank will get a finish, just like the Henry Martinez fight type of situation. So maybe Krookshank can put on a display here. But if Rio plays it smart and just solely focuses on the takedown, then he's got a chance. I mean, Rio did shoot in for takedowns against Ferguson, but Ferguson is a much more accomplished wrestler than Krookshank, and he was able to sprawl and get out of the way and keep Rio standing. So if Krookshank can keep Rio standing, Krookshank is going to destroy him. But if Rio can get it on the ground, then he's got a chance. I mean, he's a live dog if he can get it on the ground. I just don't know if he is. Like, Rio just has not looked very good in the Trinaldo fight or the Ferguson fight. I mean, he got destroyed in both of them. So that does scare me quite a bit. So I just, if Rio was a little bit better on the feet to help set up these takedowns, I would give him the benefit of the doubt here. But he's just, when all you've got is the shot, then Krookshank knows it's coming, and he should be able to avoid it. So I'm picking Krookshank, but not a lot of confidence because Krookshank doesn't have a very good chin, and there's just a couple other things that maybe Rio does get him down. The desperation fuels him. But I'm picking Krookshank, but not a ton of confidence. So moving on, we have a bantamweight contest featuring Junior Hernandez, who is 14-5 overall, taking on Hugo Viana, who is 7-2. So, Nick, what's the oddsmaker's perspective here?
Viana opens up -280. The comeback on Hernandez +200. And again, another line that kind of got bet up. Viana's sitting at -350 right now, 5 dimes. You know, I'm going to favor Viana in this fight because this is an interesting matchup. These guys should be nothing but fireworks with each other here because both of them have good takedown defense, so I'm expecting it to stay up on the feet, and both these guys are talented strikers as well, especially at the 135 weight class. We know it's going to be all action all the time with these two guys, and for as long as it lasts, because even at 135, typically you don't get a ton of KOs in that weight class, but if you're going to see a KO, it might be in this fight for sure because Viana's got nasty knockout power. I guess I'm going to start with him first. I mean, on the feet, Viana, very talented striker. He's still a little raw, but he's developing really fast in his skill set. I think he's got some serious power in his hands. He starts to get a little over aggressive at times. That is one concern. He has so much knockout power that he puts a lot into his punches, so he's going to make mistakes and leave openings in that aspect. But he does utilize different parts of the clinch well. Again, he's got great takedown defense, and the grappling part of his game is basically one of these type of fighters that sprawls and brawls and uses his wrestling defense to just keep it up and just, again, try to knock you out. So he doesn't really go for takedowns that often at all. And he utilizes, again, his takedown defense to stand and bang, and that's what he's going to do. It's no secret, really. He's not going to be one to look for takedowns or try to grapple with you. Now, on the other hand, Hernandez is a little bit more well-rounded. I mean, he has the striking ability to. I know he got blown out in his fight against Lucas Martins. He just got really dismantled in that fight. I mean, there's not much more you could say. He got overwhelmed early. But overall, I think he's a lot better than that. I mean, Hernandez is a pretty talented guy. Another one of these guys that have been on the smaller shows on Access TV and those type of organizations. But he does have some skill, definitely. Again, starting off with the striking, I mean, he has good boxing. He has KO power in his hands. He's got some speed to go along with it. He moves and counters well. Defensively, he's another guy. Obviously, leaves a little bit of openings. He likes to mix in his kicks in his arsenal as well. So the guy is aggressive. He's definitely in his realm when it comes to striking, but he has decent wrestling. And when it comes to the grappling aspect of the fight, he is going to have an advantage over Viana because I think with his wrestling, he has also a more solid jiu-jitsu game and overall grappling game too. But again, as I said at the beginning, I really don't expect this fight to hit the floor too often because I think both of these guys can neutralize each other out that way. So it's going to be a stand-up fight. And if it is going to be a slugfest, I got to give the slight edge to Viana here because I do think he has, again, more knockout power. He might not be the more technical striker here, but I think he has more possibilities of ending the fight if it does stay upright. If not, maybe causing enough damage to control the pace of this fight and win a decision. So got to go with Viana here, but Hernandez is definitely going to be game.
Yeah, what's funny about Viana is, he was a decision machine, and then he dropped down to the bantamweight division, and then just suddenly became this big power striker. I mean, his UFC or bantamweight debut against Ruben Duran was amazing. I mean, he dropped Duran like 4 or 5 times, and he was just winging overhand rights, just spamming him like it was a video game, and that was the only button he knew. And it just kept connecting, and Duran just stood right in front of him and just ate it until eventually he just got twisted sideways and knocked out. I mean, it was a really amazing performance, and I think that might have given Viana just a little too much love for his right hand. I mean, you look at his fights since then. He took on T.J. Dillashaw, and he just went right at Dillashaw and was just winging punches. I mean, he actually did tag Dillashaw and hurt him briefly, but then Dillashaw came back and just steamrolled him with some nasty, nasty shots, and then ended up getting the TKO. So that's actually the most recent fight that Viana's coming off of. So he got blasted, and then obviously Hernandez's UFC debut was terrible. The guy trained out of Iowa and at Miocic fighting system his whole career. That was actually his first fight outside the country. So Hernandez is, he's got experience against some tough guys. He's actually scored multiple wins throughout his career over UFC veterans, mostly, Ultimate Fighter guys in the Midwest. But, he has stepped in there against quite a few guys. And he actually trained at American Top Team before his last fight, and he actually moved back to Miocic for this fight. So he's going to be a little closer to home in the Iowa area, and he'll be pretty close to Chicago. So I think that the home cooking might help him out a little bit here. Plus, that last fight he did take it on a little bit of short notice, not a lot. And normally he does have a good chin, but he got suckered into a brawl against Martins, and he paid for it. And he just couldn't handle the reach. He ate a really big right hand and left himself exposed for the choke. And I think overall, though, Hernandez actually does have a really nice right hand. He's good in the clinch. He's solid on the ground. He's aggressive. He pushes the pace. And he's got big fight experience against a lot of top guys. And Viana, he does have that big right hand. He's a tough one, Brazil veteran. But, man, I'm really worried about him. The way that he throws his overhand right repeatedly, I just cannot see him being able to keep that pace up over the course of 3 rounds. If he keeps throwing it the way that he does, he's going to be exhausted by the midway or even end of the first round, just like Fejao was when he fought Thiago Silva. So I think that as long as Hernandez doesn't get suckered into a big brawl and eat these big right hands, then Hernandez is a live dog here. People are completely undervaluing him because he had such a horrible UFC debut. So I think as long as Hernandez survives this first round, I think Hernandez can win this fight, whether it's decision or a TKO late. So I'm picking the dog here at a huge upset price, so we'll see if it pays off. But I actually like Hernandez here. Now, we've got another fight here on the prelims, a very interesting bantamweight contest featuring budding rivalry between Rufus Sport and the MMA Lab, with Chico Camas out of Rufus Sport, 13-4 overall, taking on Yautsin Mesa of the MMA Lab, who is 20-8 overall. So, Nick, what's the oddsmaker's perspective here?
Camas minus 230, come back on Mesa plus 170. And like you said, Brian, another Rufus Sport product in Camas. And I'm glad to see him back because I think he's an exciting fighter. Well, a lot of these guys, again, at 135 are exciting fighters. So this should be another barn burner here. I think starting off with this fight, it's basically another one of these striker versus grappler type of matchups. So, and Camas being the striker, he's coming from Rufus Sport, obviously, from that training camp, which we just mentioned. And really, when it comes to striking, there's not too much better out there. Rufus has really put together a good nucleus, and, man, the way these guys are learning and improving their overall skill set in MMA, but especially their striking, is phenomenal, and I like to see it, really. So it's basically Camas the striker taking on Mesa, which Mesa, I guess you want to give him a little bit of credit for being a striker, but you got to be honest here. Looking at the footage, he's not a striker at all. He's definitely a grappling-based fighter. So, again, you got another striker versus grappler. So Camas has a little bit more, though, than just striking. I think he's improving his grappling. Again, working with Askren and crew over there at Rufus Sport has really helped because his takedown defense is getting better. I think his offensive grappling is getting better. His wrestling, like his takedown ability, is improving as well. And then he scrambles out of submissions. Against a good BJJ fighter, he's going to be in some serious trouble at times. He can put himself in bad spots. But overall, I think his sub-defense is pretty solid. And he definitely has the edge against standing in this fight. So for him, he's going to look to sprawl and brawl again, one of these type of fights, and he's going to look to try to pick Mesa apart on the feet. He's going to probably have a difficult time doing that, though, because Mesa is going to be a little bit bigger, going to be a little bit possibly stronger than Camas here, so he's going to have his chances to take this fight to the floor. And that's where the intriguing factor is in this fight. Again, I basically said Mesa's striking is not very good as far as what you see on film. He doesn't offer a lot on the feet. He's just physically strong, so that gives him a little bit of power on the feet. All these guys can be dangerous in that aspect, but other than that, his favorite techniques really seem to be leg kicks. He throws a lot of them. I guess he's not as worried about being put on his back because he does have good takedown defense. And again, the best attribute of Mesa is his grappling. So he uses his striking to set up his takedowns to get the fight to the floor. And once he has you on the floor, though, he does have some good grappling, has the ability to control, has good ground and pound. He looks for position, and he does look to submit you as well. So if Camas gets put in a bad spot, Mesa's grappling in his subgame could be enough to possibly get him the W here against Camas. But overall, I still think that Camas is the more complete fighter at this stage, and whether he adapts to the size of Mesa or not is going to be the question here as well. I think he's going to have to do that early on, and we're going to have to see him stuff some early takedowns, dictate the pace of this fight, and then he'll have success. So that's going to be another key to this fight. But I got to go with Camas because he is simply the better fighter. I think, again, with so many guys from Roufusport being on this card, he's going to be prepared. He's going to be mentally ready to come in here and win this fight. So my pick is going to be Camas.
Yeah, I'm not quite concerned about Camas having to deal with the size. I mean, you look at his 3 UFC fights so far, and the first one was against Dustin Page, one of the tallest bantamweights that was on the roster, and then his last one was against Kang, who was a huge, huge bantamweight, one of the biggest bantamweights on the roster. So, even though Mesa's taller and lankier, like the guy, that usually only gives an advantage on the feet if they know what they're doing. And as you mentioned, Mesa has no clue what he's doing on the feet. His punches are terrible. All he can do is throw the low kick, which is decent. But, I mean, everybody out of the MMA lab has a decent low kick, and I'm sure that Chico Camas knows how to defend against that. But you look at these guys, Camas is 28 years old, Mesa's 32, and the main thing here, Mesa needs to get this fight to the ground. And while Camas did have some trouble in his last fight against Kang, who I think is one of the better bantamweights on the roster, I think Mesa, I'm really not sure that Mesa's good enough overall to do it and actually keep Camas down. Camas actually, when he's on the ground, has a very good defensive guard. It limits damage, and he can scramble, and he definitely does a good job at avoiding submission trouble. But Mesa, man, there's so many holes everywhere. I mean, the guy gives up submission opportunities to opponents repeatedly. He has a bad chin. He has really bad striking defense. And he does have good cardio, but Camas has good cardio too. I mean, Camas has absolutely zero quit in him. I mean, you look at that last fight, he was well on his way to losing a decision, and then he came back in the second round to take the second round against Kang, and then almost finished it right at the end of the third. That actually helped him win the close decision. I mean, you can agree or not agree with the decision, but I mean, the fact that Camas is always in a fight. So I just don't see Mesa being able to control Camas for 3 rounds to take a decision here. And if Camas can keep it standing, he's not the best stand-up fighter ever, but I mean, the guy does have a really wicked right hand. I mean, he snapped Kang's head back real nasty a couple times, and if those connect on Mesa, then Mesa is in deep, deep trouble. I mean, the guy does not have very good ability to absorb punishment at all. So I really think that if Camas can get his hands on Mesa, Mesa is going to be in some big trouble. So I think Camas takes this one. I'm not sure that he'll be able to finish it or not, but I can definitely see him getting a decision. As long as he plays it smart, doesn't dive into Mesa's guard, and can just outwork him on the feet or finish him on the feet. So I like Camas to win this one as well. Now moving on to a very, very interesting bantamweight contest, we have 2 veterans in Eddie Weinland coming in with a 29-1 overall record, coming off of his recent title shot against Yves Jaboin, who is 19-8 overall. Now, Nick, where did you open this line, and what have the numbers kind of told us so far?
My opening line, Weinland minus 305, the comeback plus 225 on Jaboin. Weinland a solid favorite at 3-1, and it actually got bet up a little bit. Weinland is minus 355 right now, and stylistically it is an interesting matchup because you got 2 guys that have some serious knockout power going at it, but Weinland's going to have that edge where he can control where the fight goes. He's got obviously the wrestling edge where he's able to pretty much dictate the pace of the fight, stay off his back, and he's got really good hands. But it's going to be interesting because Yves also has tremendous striking, and he has the ability to keep the fight off the floor as well. And overall, I think that Yves is a little bit more of the flashier, better striker. I mean, the guy's fast, explosive everywhere. He counters well, has a good fight IQ, and a lot of power to go along with it. But he is it looks like he's hitting a bit of a decline here. And I think Weinland, on the other hand, is hitting his groove a little bit. And again, the striking is going to be a little bit back and forth, but Weinland, I think, has a superior actual boxing in this fight. I mean, the guy hits with power, he throws with intent, and he's got the better chin right now. I mean, the guy's tough as nails. I think as far as cardio goes, he's got a slight cardio edge in this fight as well. He's going to be able to, again, dictate the pace of this fight, and I think he's going to eventually be able to land hard enough that he might catch that suspect chin of Yves right now. If not, I think he's going to be able to at least control enough of the fight where he's going to probably grind out a decision. I mean, he's up against the cage. It's going to be a dirty type of fight, dirty boxing mixed in. So I think he's going to grind out a decision win, if not get a stoppage over Yves. And Yves is a very talented fighter. He's one of my favorite guys to watch at 135 because of his offensive style. But lately he's actually been looking for takedowns and looking to be more of a ground fighter. He's not going to have that success against Weinland. And that also concerns me a little bit with Yves because that's telling me that he knows he's getting tagged a little bit too often and he's not comfortable there. So I'm going to pick Weinland to win this fight. I think he gets back on track and continues to climb towards possibly another title shot.
Yeah, I think you were pulling a little bit of punches there about Yves Jaboin. I think he's in a steep decline heading into this fight. Obviously, he got absolutely blasted by Brad Pickett with an uppercut in 2 fights ago, and then in his most recent performance, I mean, he eked out an extremely close split decision victory over Dustin Pegg that, in my opinion, he should have lost. And in that fight, he hardly struck at all. He kind of stuck it to the ground the whole time, and he got outworked on the ground. It was not a very good performance at all. And I think Yves Jaboin is almost on his way out as a fighter. I mean, and as you mentioned, Eddie Weinland is coming into his own here. You know, Weinland's 29, Jaboin's 34. That's a big difference for me. And you talked a little bit about Jaboin's power, but I mean, we haven't really seen a lot of good, heavy shots that he's landed throughout his career in UFC or WEC, other than a little bit on Jeff Hoagland, maybe more Cominic to the body, but nothing real special. I mean, he throws a lot of strikes. He is diverse. He mixes things up well, but I don't think he can take it like Eddie Weinland. And Weinland has this really interesting, unique fighting style where he's always pushing forward, but he's a counter striker, so he keeps his hands a little bit lower, and he's basically just baiting his opponents to throw at him, and that's when he tags you with the right hand. So Weinland has a really unique, interesting, unorthodox style that I like a lot. A lot of pressure. And Weinland is better in stopping takedowns. I think he's definitely better on the ground than Jaboin, even though Jaboin's been looking to get the fight to the ground a little bit more lately. But chin strength, definitely a big factor for Weinland. Weinland is coming off a TKO loss, but I think that was just, he ducked right into a spinning back kick to the face against the champion. So I think that was just more unlucky than anything. And yeah, I'm definitely picking Eddie Weinland here. I mean, he's a big favorite, and I can completely see why. He completely deserves it, and he should probably win this fight, most likely by knockout. Now, Reed, what do the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, I'm going to agree with you. I think the numbers do suggest that Yves is he's going to have some trouble with the chin, and he's the second oldest guy on the card this evening, and he's been knocked down a few times, and on a punch-for-punch basis, it's actually quite a bit, at least for a bantamweight. So to be going up against a guy like Weinland, who has 6 knockdowns in his WEC, UFC career, that's quite a few. He knows how to find people and knows how to put them down. That's a bad combination, to have an older guy who's been knocked out coming against that. So I do see Weinland as a justifiable favorite here. He also has a big pace advantage. He tends to operate at a very high pace, so even if he's not necessarily getting the knockout right off the bat, he's probably going to be winning rounds. So, yeah, he is a justifiable favorite here, and the risk of also a finish is pretty good for Weinland if you're going that route.
Excellent. Now, moving on, we have another really interesting bantamweight contest featuring 2 younger prospects in the Ultimate Fighter veteran Alex Caceras coming in with a 9-5 mark with 1 no contest against rising phenom here, Sergio Pettis, who is the younger brother of UFC lightweight champion Anthony Pettis, and he comes in with a 10-0 record. So, Nick, where did you open this one, and how has the public kind of shifted things so far?
Pettis opens a favorite, -245. The comeback on Caceres, +175. some crazy action early on with this fight because it dipped below 200 all the way down. I think it was around minus 170 or so for Pettis, and then overnight action shifted the line back up to almost 3-1 for Pettis over Caceras, and now it's shifted back down to minus 2-1, about 215 at the time of the recording at 5 dimes. So some decent support for both fighters back and forth in this particular matchup, and it should be a great fight. It's a big test for Pettis. I mean, he's coming in as the hyped prospect at 135. Caceras is the proven UFC vet at this point in his career, believe it or not, at 135. He has some very solid wins on his resume, and he's a great overall fighter. So this is a big step up in competition for Pettis. But it's definitely a step that I think he can take and possibly get the W at. I know Caceras is a tough guy, and he brings a lot of intangibles to the table, but I mean, on the feet, Pettis is a very talented and gifted striker. He's a little sniper. I mean, he's got very fast, quick movement, has a lot of power, and he stays on you. He's fought a lot of guys that have kind of the reach advantage that Caceras has coming into this fight. It's 73 inches, actually, compared to Pettis' 69, but Pettis has fought in taller guys even before the UFC. I know a lot of people are going to revert back to his last fight against Campuzano, but even in RFA, I believe it was, against Jones. Jones is a pretty lanky, tall fighter in his own right. A little bit different than Caceras, of course, but Pettis is used to fighting tall guys. He knows the key is to get inside, and he does that well. And actually, he starts getting busy, and he makes life a little bit miserable, I think, for strikers overall. So that's the impressive part of Pettis' game, but not just that. I mean, his wrestling keeps on developing. His ground game's legit. If you put him on his back, he can submit you. He scrambles and gets top position. So Pettis is a very legit, solid prospect, no doubt about it. Now, it's all up to Caceras here because they match up pretty good. Caceras, again, as I said, he has that reach advantage, has that length going into it. He has decent striking in his own right. He has a nice lead jab. He uses that well. I think he's going to have to continually keep that in the face of Pettis. He does use his kicks, and he has a good clinch game as well, Caceras does. So a lot of nice things to be viewed in this fight, I think, as it goes back and forth. But the key to Caceras winning this fight, I think, as an underdog would be, can he transition to the ground and get top position on Pettis? That's where he might be a live dog here. If he can use his wrestling instead of defensively like he normally does, a little bit more offensively, I think he can make life miserable for Pettis here. He doesn't tend to do that enough, so I'm a little skeptical that he'll do that in this fight. He doesn't tend to shoot for takedowns. Most of the time he ends up in top position if from scrambles from out of the bottom, and he ends up on top a lot. So if he comes up with a good game plan and sticks to it, I think he can win this fight and possibly beat Pettis. But overall, I got to lean with Pettis in this fight. I think he is the rightful favorite because he's just a little sniper. He's continuing to improve, and more times than not, I think it ends up staying up on the feet, and you got to give the slight edge to Pettis if it does, even beyond that reach. So I'm going to go with Pettis here, but there might be some dog value in Caceras.
Yeah, this is a really interesting fight to me as well. Just based on their most recent performances, Pettis did not have a very good UFC debut. He is only 20 years old, so he's got a lot of room for growth. But, he entered UFC with a ton of hype, and he did have some moments. He's technical on the feet. He mixes things up. He's diverse. Got some nice leg kicks. But he's a little too patient on the feet for me at times, which I think against somebody with a pretty high work rate like Caceras could lead to some problems. And as we saw, he can be wrestled, he can be controlled. I mean, Will Campuzano's not a guy with a great ground game, but he got Pettis on his back repeatedly in that fight, and that should have been a lot closer than the eventual outcome was. I think it was 30-27, 30-27, 29-28. I mean, that was a fight that some people scored for Will Campuzano. And looking at Caceras, he's 25, so it's not like he's this old dog. He's long, he's flashy, as you mentioned, he's got a really great right jab, and I think another thing that I like is he is a southpaw, so that's not something that Pettis is used to seeing all the time. And while Caceras doesn't have a great offensive wrestling game, so I don't think he can take advantage of some of Pettis' faults there, he is really active on the ground with scrambles, really crazy transitions. He's always going for submissions, although he doesn't usually land them. On the feet, I think Caceras is a lot more light on his feet, bounces around a lot more than Pettis does. He mixes things up well, but one thing that does scare me, he leaves his hands a little low, so that's something that Pettis, who's really quick and has those nice short shots, he could take advantage of with counters. And I like that Caceras moved out to the MMA lab. It showed in his last fight. He looked a lot better. He looked good on the feet against Roland Delorme. But, Roland Delorme's stand-up is not even close to as good as Pettis'. So that does scare me a little bit. But I think as long as Caceras stays composed, I think that he could outwork Pettis and win a decision here. I don't see a finish coming, but I think it's possible, especially if the same Pettis showed up from his UFC debut that fights on Saturday night. Now, Reed, what do you kind of think about Caceras entering this fight?
Well, I do think there's maybe some upset potential here. I don't have any data on Pettis, and so I'm doing this half blind because he just fought too recently and I haven't updated the database. So I'm looking just at numbers on Caceras, and they are very, very good when it comes to point striking. He's extremely accurate. And Nick used the phrase sniper to describe Pettis. That's also true for Caceras. I mean, he is definitely a good point striker. He doesn't have a lot of power. He hasn't scored any knockdowns, but he's high volume and he maintains good pace. So he gets in and out fast, and for whatever reason, he has been finding a lot of success. It probably has to do with his range and the southpaw. He's young, he's flashy. He's a lot of the things, actually, that we would describe Pettis as. So it's interesting that he's going to have a huge size advantage and a southpaw advantage. So if it turns into a back-and-forth three-rounder, who's scoring the more points, do not count Caceras out. I think as an underdog, he's got potential. Pettis obviously has some star pedigree with his brother, and there's a lot of hype around this guy. But now he's in the big pool, and he's up against a bigger opponent who's been around a while, even though he's still young. So this is not one where I'm just going to jump on the favorite. This is one I think there's a few ingredients that would make me hesitate to take the favorite altogether, and possibly even look for an underdog play, depending on where the line ends up.
Yeah, and one last thing that scares me about Pettis a little bit is I think he's a flyweight fighting in the bantamweight division right now. Maybe eventually he would come to bantamweight, but at this point in his career, this is a guy that's fought flyweight multiple times, and I really think at this point in his career he should be fighting in the flyweight division. So I'm a little surprised that after the UFC debut, where maybe some guys will come in, on shorter notice and fight at a heavier weight class, I'm surprised that he's staying at bantamweight, because he is going to have a severe size disadvantage throughout his entire bantamweight career here, unless he gets a little bigger over time, being just 20 years old. Now, moving on, we have the first fight on the main card for UFC on Fox 10. It is a featherweight matchup featuring top guys. Darren Elkins coming in with a 17-3 record, taking on Jeremy Stephens, who is 22-9 overall. Now, Nick, what's the MMA Oddsmaker's perspective on this one?
Well, my opening line was Stephens minus 130, the comeback in Elkins minus 110. Stephens did get bet up a little bit. He was as high as 160, 170, 180, around there, if I'm not mistaken. Could have creeped up a little bit higher. But right now, at the time of the recording, actually, the line coming back down, a little bit more support coming in on Elkins, so Stephens is minus 140 again. So slight move in the favor of Stephens, but another competitive line. And it's an interesting fight, again, because the way these guys match up. Elkins, we all know, is a typical tremendous grinder. That's how he gets the job done. That's how he wins fights, by imposing his will. He has a lot of heart. He's a tough guy. He likes to push forward and get you down to the floor, grapple you, and work his game. He has decent ground and pound. He has decent submissions, but more so than anything, he's one of those kind of lay and pray type of fighters that continues to push forward, and almost like a zombie type of fighter that he's hard to stop and hard to get rid of. But that being said, there is a few flaws in his game. I mean, he has the heart and he has the toughness, but he has been KO'd in the past. So his chin's a little bit susceptible to me. And I think Stephens, since he made the drop to 145, he's looked tremendous. I mean, he had some question marks towards the end of his 155 career, I guess you could say, in the UFC. But since he did make the drop, I think he's rejuvenated a little bit. I'm glad to see him focused, training with a great camp in Alliance. And his takedown defense continues to improve. And he's fought his share of people that like to get him to the floor, and he has been susceptible to takedowns. But I think that more times than not, the way Elkins shoots in, Stephens is going to have success stuffing some of those takedowns. And it doesn't take much for Stephens to land. He has that special knockout power on the feet, and that's what it's going to be kind of, I think, Elkins' kryptonite in this fight. I mean, he is susceptible, again, if anything, to the knockout. And Stephens, not only does he have knockout power, I think he's kind of one of those special fighters when it comes to knockout power in his weight class at 145. He reminds me of kind of like a Michael Johnson in his fight against Tibau. We picked Johnson to win that. We thought he had kind of a special type of knockout power in that fight against Tibau. It kind of showed through there. I think Stevens is similar in that kind of phenomenal power that he brings to the table, especially at 145. So not a good combination for Elkins' chin. So I think Elkins can win this fight if he grinds it out, continues to have success getting Stevens on the floor, maybe even trying to work for submission. But more times than not, I think Stevens is going to probably catch him at some point while it does stay on the feet. So I'm going to pick Stevens here, probably by knockout. I think that's the way it's going to go down. But Elkins, he can win this fight if he does stick to a good game plan. His chin holds up, and he can grind this fight out. So my pick is Stevens, but Elkins is a close dog for a reason here.
This is a really interesting fight to me. I really don't think that the age will be much of a difference here. Elkins is 29, Stevens is 27. Elkins is so aggressive on the ground and in his pursuit of takedowns and trying to get it to the clinch. I mean, the way that he fights, he's basically just pushing forward, putting pressure on his opponents, trying to set up takedowns. He does have a little bit of sneaky power in his left and right jab, but as we saw in the Carvalho fight, but primarily he's just trying to distract you, get you to lower your defenses, and then get in and get you on your back. He's a guy that needs the clinch, needs to score takedowns to get this fight. He's a grinder. But Stevens, he's 27, but a lot older than that in fight years. I mean, he has taken a lot of damage throughout the course of his career, especially in that 3-fight skid to end his lightweight career before dropping down. You know, he got lit up a little bit and then knocked out for the first time against Yves Edwards. So that is a little scary, you know, because dropping down in weight class, you might, you know, you're a little more susceptible to the knockout. But thankfully, he has looked really good so far, absolutely obliterating Honey Jason in his last fight. I mean, he looked amazing in there. It was less than a minute, but brutal head kick and then just finished it up with a right hand. So that power definitely translates to the featherweight division. And there are some things that scare me a little bit about Stevens. He doesn't have very good stand-up defense. He gets outstruck a lot, but it's his power that saves him. And several times throughout his career, his power has scored him a late knockout in a fight he was losing, or he has turned it on and been able to turn around a fight that he was losing. So that does scare me a little bit. He has decent wrestling, but he usually only uses it when he's getting outstruck on the feet and he needs to change things up a little bit. So I really don't think that the wrestling is going to be too much of a factor here unless he's able to use it properly defensively against Elkins. And the other thing, Elkins has a ton of heart. We've seen him lose the first round and then just keep going and be persistent and aggressive and eventually just wear his opponents down and take the final 2 rounds after losing the first. So that is something I think could happen here. So I'm going to go against the grain here a little bit, and I'm going to pick Darren Elkins to pull off the upset, although there is a chance that Jeremy Stephens knocks him out in the first round when Elkins does get off to that slow start. So, Reed, who do the numbers agree with here?
Well, both of you, actually. So I'm looking at those numbers, and we've identified some weaknesses with Elkins' game, and that is he's willing to take a punch, and his head strike defense is the second worst on the card. He's way too willing to absorb a few strikes. Fortunately, he's only been dropped one time, but he does have losses. And on the flip side, Jeremy Stephens has knockdown power that is well above the average for a featherweight. So normally featherweight fights, you only see about a fifth or a quarter of those fights ending by knockout. But Stephens does have some heavy hands for sure. But his accuracy isn't great, yet he's against a guy like Elkins who's willing to take a punch. Now on the flip side, we've got Elkins, who has a very high pace of activity. He tends to severely outwork his opponents, whereas Jeremy Stephens tends to be a counter-striker. So I'm thinking, on a round-by-round basis, Elkins has the tools to win rounds. Yet, just like you pointed out, he's at risk of getting tagged with a heavy shot. And so I can see this going either way. There's pretty clear paths to victory for each guy. But I think it's more of a coin flip than perhaps the betting line would suggest.
All right, excellent. Now moving on, we have a very interesting lightweight matchup featuring Donald Cerrone coming in with a 21-6 record with 1 no contest against Adriano Martins, who is just making his second UFC appearance and has a 25-6 overall mark. So, Nick, what's the oddsmaker's perspective here?
Well, I opened Cerrone minus 265, the comeback on Martins, plus 185. Got to be honest with you, I opened a little bit higher than I should have here, and the public immediately, actually, the betting action, maybe not immediately, but between the time we opened and now, obviously, came in on Martins and bet it down. So I think that initial action might be the way to go here, because Cerrone is kind of a tough spot to bet, especially against a very solid fighter. I know Martin's a little bit more unknown to the, I think, the average MMA fan, and that's one of the reasons I kind of went with the public hype. I figured Cerrone would be the popular bet here in most people's minds, and I think it still will, and I think we'll see the line continue to climb up back in Cerrone's favor as we get closer to fight time. But as of right now, it's under 2-1, and I kind of like that spot because I think Martins can definitely hang in there and give Cerrone a tough test in this fight. I know Cerrone, obviously, he's known for a striking attack. He has a long range, and he used it pretty well. I mean, the guy mixes up his strikes very well. He has knockout power in his hands and his feet, and then also has tremendous wrestling to go along with it. I mean, he's got good takedown defense, underrated offensive wrestling, and a heck of a submission game. I mean, if you look at his resume, it looks like he's more of a submission-based fighter with all the subs on his resume, but he's really a complete tough-as-nails type of fighter. But a lot of question marks about around his performance recently. I mean, he's kind of been off and on a little bit. You look at him one night, he shows up and he looks tremendous. Looks like he can contend for the title again, as he once was kind of climbing that ladder towards that title shot. In other fights, he shows up and he just doesn't look like he's the same type of fighter. So, again, a little bit too inconsistent for my liking here. And I think Martins is coming in to this fight in a pretty good spot. I think that he's a little bit, again, underrated, unknown, I think, to the majority of the fans out there. He is coming off of a very impressive win, a dominant performance over Krookshank. And Krookshank did typically get some public support. So I think that had to impress some fans out there, and that's why you're seeing a little bit of early love in Martins as far as the betting line goes. But that being said, I know that Cerrone has fought the better competition. Martins, this is kind of a big step up in competition for him. I mean, he hasn't fought anybody probably in his career the level of Cerrone, or at least at this stage. But I think he could perform. I think he could come through here and make the striking match close, if not land effectively on it. Martins has a nasty left hand. Cerrone is susceptible on the feet to that left. So I think Martins has enough power, possibly even to catch Cerrone and put him out, even though he's tough as nails. But that being said, I think he can land effectively enough on Cerrone and back Cerrone up at times that it's going to be a pretty close decision either way here. Martins also has nasty inside leg kicks. He has underrated wrestling. So this is a very even type of fight. I think it's a little bit closer than the line indicates here as well. But ultimately, you've got to go with the experience, and you have to go with what you know. And Cerrone has proved himself more so than Martins, in my opinion. So I'm going to pick Cerrone to win this fight. I think he can probably outpoint Martins, and he has that high-level experience and competition that he can perform well when he needs to. So if Cerrone shows up like he should beat Martins. But if he doesn't show up 100% and he underestimates Martins at all, Martins can win this fight. So it might be another dog or pass situation.
Yeah, and you brought up about Cerrone being unpredictable a little bit. I mean, I think that was sugarcoating it. I mean, he is unpredictable in a bad way. I mean, he's a complete head case at times. Sometimes Cerrone's amazing. I mean, he looked really good in his last fight against Evan Dunham. He looked great against Jeremy Stephens despite having like a bowel disorder or something. He destroyed Dennis Seaver and Charles Oliveira, with technical boxing and great kicks. But then, sometimes he just has this deer in the headlights moment where he just goes into a fight and he's a punching bag. Almost every time it's been against the elite guys, guys like Anthony Pettis, Nate Diaz, Rafael Dos Anjos, even the second fight against the old former champ Ben Henderson. All those fights, I mean, he just got smashed. So that does scare me. But, at least when you look at the common thing with all those fights that he looked terrible in, it was all against guys that are currently in the top 10. And I just do not see Adriano Martins as that type of guy. He's more the guy that Donald Cerrone shows up to fight, doesn't psych himself out, and takes care of business. Now, Cerrone does have a lot of things that he does well. He's really active. He's very accurate. He has some nasty, nasty leg kicks. And he's excellent on the ground, even though Martins does have that big jiu-jitsu grappling background. Cerrone has a lot more submissions, and he's very capable on the ground. I mean, choking out Evan Dunham is a big deal. And although a lot of the way that Cerrone sets up his submissions is he actually hurts his opponents on the feet, and then he just hops on it and dives on a submission because he just smells blood so bad. Now, Martins, on the other hand, 31 years old, this is a huge step up in competition for him. He was the former Jungle Fights lightweight champ, but he fought in Strikeforce against Georges Gurgel, and then he made his UFC debut against Darren Krookshank on his home turf. So I think he's had a lot of advantages here so far against not so great competition. But he is left-handed, which might give him a little bit of a step up here, and he likes to control the cage center, but I don't think that that's going to factor in here because Cerrone's a lot more aggressive, and I think he's going to push him back. And he does have decent striking, a pretty good straight left, and he is excellent on the ground, but he's the type of guy that actually, despite his grappling credentials, has fallen in love with his striking a little bit and will go for the knockout a lot more often than the submission, even though he did get the submission in his last fight. And that's definitely that armbar / Kimura that he was going for against Krookshank. There's no way he would get that against Donald Cerrone. Cerrone's a little too slick for that. And I do think that Martins has some decent takedowns, but they're more set up from his opponent's aggression that he can change levels and get him on the ground. So I do think that Martins, while good, he's not Donald Cerrone's caliber. So I'm a little surprised that the public was actually backing Martins as much as they did, at least briefly. So I definitely think that this is Donald Cerrone's fight to lose. Now, moving on to the co-main event of the evening, we have a very, very interesting fight featuring two guys that are on a nice little run here in the heavyweight division, featuring top prospect Stipe Miocic, who has a 10-1 record, and he's facing former title challenger Gabriel Gonzaga, who comes in at 16-7 overall. Now, Nick, where'd you open this fight, and what's the public kind of told you so far?
Well, I opened Miocic minus 210, the comeback on Gonzaga plus 160. Since that time, a little bit of action coming in on Stipe, and it's kind of come back down to earth a little bit. It was almost a 3-1 now. It's back down to 240. So some support coming back in on Gonzaga. That's an interesting heavyweight fight, no doubt about it. I mean, Gonzaga been on a little roll. He's looked actually pretty good. I mean, he's fighting a little bit smarter. He's got that knockout power that's coming through for him in his last couple fights, no doubt about it. He's beginning to use a little bit more of that grappling and jiu-jitsu that we've all kind of heard about from the beginning of his UFC career that he didn't really use too much. So Gonzaga, I think, is kind of the best version of himself that he's been at this stage of his career. And we all know how much of a well-rounded fighter the guy is. I mean, he definitely has some skill on the feet, has tremendous knockout power. He can throw kicks and knock you out, obviously, with the Krylov fight back in the day. I mean, he just mixes it up so good, and he's just a threat to knock you out with anything he throws. He has that much power. And, of course, his wrestling's pretty solid, and once he does get the fight to the floor, he's got a jiu-jitsu edge over most heavyweights, no doubt about it. And he will have a significant jiu-jitsu edge over Stipe. So that has to be, I guess, clearly brought out there. But that being said, I think it's a tough matchup for him because I think Stipe has the wrestling credentials to make this fight miserable for Gonzaga. I mean, he can keep this fight upright, and I think that even though Gonzaga has that kind of knockout power, Stipe also has a ton of power with his hands as well, and his boxing's a little bit better. I think he's more technical on the feet. He can outpoint Gonzaga a little bit more, and he might not have that pure knockout power. He hasn't shown it yet, like that one-punch power that Gonzaga has, but he's the type of guy that puts a few punches together, and then he's more than capable of landing that third or fourth shot and putting you out. So I think that's the way it's going to go. I think you're going to see a lot of movement for Stipe, kind of like the blueprint that he used against the Roy Nelson fight. He's going to look for his moment, and then he's going to end up catching Gonzaga and putting him out. I think Gonzaga, one of his main weaknesses, obviously, is his chin. I mean, the guy's been knocked out, if I'm not mistaken, like 6 times. So not a good formula. I think when you're fighting an up-and-coming heavyweight prospect like Stipe, I think Stipe, again, he has underrated boxing, underrated striking altogether, and that's just not a good formula right now for Gonzaga. So even though Gonzaga might be the more well-rounded fighter, Stipe at this point and at this stage of his career is the more dangerous fighter and the more capable fighter. So I'm looking for Stipe to get a big win and take a continued step forward in his UFC career here.
And what I like about Miocic, 31 years old, but he's an incredible athlete. I mean, the guy's got the wrestling credentials. He's a former baseball player, a really technically sound overall fighter too. I mean, he's a technician on the feet. Very good combinations. He uses his jab well. He has pretty good power in his right hand, but he doesn't overcommit and leave himself exposed. In his last fight, he used really good footwork, constantly circling away from Roy Nelson's big power right hand, and he's probably going to do the same thing here against Gonzaga, because almost all of Gonzaga's power comes from his right hand and his right kicks. So as long as he's circling away, he can reduce the damage even if he does get hit by him. And I think he does have some solid combinations. As long as he paces himself, he'll be fine. I mean, he did get tired in the Stefan Struve fight, but that was overseas. That was his first time over there, real emotional, main event, and I think it got to him a little bit. But in his last fight, he had a much higher output against Roy Nelson, and he didn't slow down at all. He looked great. So I think he got that under control. And he does have solid wrestling. He has used it in the UFC, but I think he's going to use it defensively here to just keep the fight standing, and he would only take Gonzaga down if he maybe to steal a round just to secure it at the end of the round, because I doubt that Gonzaga could tap him out within a few seconds. And I do think Gonzaga, man, he's been on a nice little run. He's won 4 of his last five fights, but the one time he stepped in there against a legit top 10 guy in Travis Brown, I mean, he got crushed. I mean, maybe those elbows were a little illegal, but I mean, that was a landslide for Travis Brown, and Gonzaga was doing everything he needed to do in that fight to try to win it, trying to get it to the ground rather than stand and trade. So he is a little bit of a big fish in a little pond, training out of Massachusetts in his own gym. But in his last fights, he's actually demonstrated some nice little growth. He has a sneaky right counter hook that has caught Dave Herman and Sean Jordan and hurt them both and actually helped him get the knockouts. But even though he's been on a really nice run, he hasn't scored a really big signature win during that run. So he does have 4 finishes in his last 5 fights, but none of them are against the top guys in the division. So he does have really heavy kicks, low and high, solid power, solid jiu-jitsu, but he has fallen in love with his striking a little bit, and as you mentioned, Nick, the chin, it's just not very good, and when he does get hit and he gets clipped, I mean, he just completely wilts, and that scares me. So, if Miocic hits him with some of the shots that Miocic hit Big Country with, I don't think Gonzaga is going to be able to hold up. So there is a little less room for error in the heavyweight division, because even if Miocic is a lot better, in my opinion, at this point in their careers, there is a chance that he gets tagged just because there's so much power in the division. But I do think Miocic should win this fight a lot more often than not. So I am picking Stipe Miocic probably by knockout, but it might end up being a decision depending on how comfortable he is. Now, Reed, what do the numbers tell us here?
Well, I really like Miocic here. The numbers are very favorable. So first of all, he's younger, he's going to have a reach advantage, and he's a lot more durable. He has a shorter career. He hasn't taken the punishment that a lot of some other heavyweights have taken. So Gonzaga now, he's a guy who literally has not gone to a decision in his UFC career. Or I guess he only went once, Brendan Schaub. But he lives by the sword, he dies by the sword. So it's a lot of action he's been in. He's been knocked out a bunch of times. Let's see, he's got 4 knockdowns in the UFC alone. That's more than anybody on the card that evening. So his chin rating is actually slightly below average, and that's even for a heavyweight, which, that number should already be a little bit poor. So he's up against a more durable and more accurate striker. Miocic has very good accuracy, especially the heavyweights tend to land a little bit more because they can't quite get out of the way. But he has been crisp. The defense is kind of a wash, but Miocic, again, has another advantage in the pace. So I'm looking down the line, and I'm seeing a lot of lineup on one side of the page for Miocic. Historically, he hasn't quite had the one-punch knockout power that a lot of heavyweights tend to show. But he did put on a pretty good, he threw some leather at Nelson, and Nelson, let's be honest, he has one of the most durable chins. I don't know how that guy stays standing sometimes. So I'm just seeing a lot of advantages line up for Miocic, and the chances of this one going 3 rounds without someone getting tagged, I think, are fairly low. So I do expect a finish here. There is that risk factor, betting on heavyweights who like to throw down. It could always go one way or the other. I think that was definitely the case in Gonzaga's last fight against Sean Jordan. That was one where I didn't see it leaving the first round, but I also found it very difficult to figure out who was more likely to land first. Here, I do think Miocic is going to be the one who's landing more often, and he's going to be the first one to score the knockdown. So that's the way the numbers go. Again, some risk involved given that they're heavyweights.
All right, excellent stuff there, Reed. Now let's move on to the main event, 5-round contest featuring former UFC lightweight champion and former WEC lightweight champion Benson Henderson, who's 19-3 overall, taking on former Strikeforce lightweight champion Josh Thompson, who is 20-5 with 1 no contest. Now, Nick, what's the oddsmaker's perspective on this one?
Henderson opens up minus 210. The comeback on Thompson, plus 160. That was my opening line. And since that time, steady action towards Ben Henderson. I mean, he's reaching to a point right now where he's minus 280 at 5 dimes. So a little bit surprising, but I guess not that surprising. I mean, Bendo was a huge favorite against Gilbert Melendez in their match as well. So a lot of these guys coming over from Strikeforce just not getting the love. But more so than that, I think it's just the amount of respect people have for Ben Henderson because they realize what they're getting with him. And in Ben Henderson, you have a very complete, tough-as-nail fighter. I mean, he's been in some tremendous wars, fought the best that there is to fight in the lightweight division, and he's come through. I mean, the judges love this guy, and he's just capable of grinding fighters out more so than most in the lightweight division. He's one of the strongest wrestling-based fighters at lightweight, and that's been getting him the job done. I mean, not to mention that on the feet, he's got tremendous power. He's got good hands. His boxing's developing. He might not have the best hands in the lightweight division, but he does pack some power in his hands, and those leg kicks are just nasty. I mean, he's got tree trunks for legs, and he knows how to use them offensively. So all of that tends to impress the judges more often than not. So he's had some close, controversial split decision wins, but it's his grinding style. He's able to sneak a takedown in here and there, even against very solid wrestlers. He's able to control the action up against the cage, and again, he lands hard shots. So Henderson, very well-rounded. I know he's coming off that submission loss, a surprising in a way submission loss, losing his title, of course, to Anthony Pettis. But more times than not, Henderson does not get caught in submissions, and he has a very good, solid defensive grappling base. So Henderson, again, a very complete fighter. Now, the funny thing is he's facing a very similar fighter in Josh Thompson. I think Josh Thompson, in a lot of ways, is actually a little bit better as far as the striking goes in this fight. I mean, he can throw more variations at you. I mean, his kicking game, I think, is more impressive. Don't get me wrong. Those nasty leg kicks of Ben Henderson are definitely impressive. But overall, Thompson can mix things up. I mean, he has the ability to spin on you. He can go low. He can go mid. He can go high. I mean, that head kick in his last fight against Nate Diaz, that's really impressive considering, Nate Diaz's length. Anyway, that being said, Thompson's just an incredible fighter in his own right, and he has a wrestling base to go along with it. So with his jiu-jitsu game, with his wrestling base, with his striking skill, this is going to be a very competitive fight. And again, Thompson, one of these guys that's been around the sport for a long time. He has a very solid resume, fought top-level competition, arguably beat Gilbert Melendez 2 out of 3 times. That last fight, very controversial, could have went either way. So he's that good. He just never seems to get that kind of respect as far as the betting public goes. With all of that being said, you got to look at how they match up and how this fight's probably going to play out. And my head tells me that Henderson should be able to do enough in this fight to win it by decision. I don't think there's going to be a stoppage in this fight. I think if there is going to be a stoppage in this fight, it might be actually Thompson catching Henderson, possibly on the feet, possibly as the fight goes on, the rocking and maybe catching him in the sub. I doubt it, though. I think more so if there's a stoppage, it's probably going to be striking. But more times than not, again, my head tells me that Henderson should do enough to win at least 3 out of 5 rounds in a competitive, tight decision. So I'm going to pick Henderson here, but this is another spot that I think if you leave it up to the judges and you're laying 250, 300, it's not a very smart bet. I think it's one of those situations that you got to lay off it, or it's possibly a dog or pass situation. So my pick's going to be Henderson to win yet another close, maybe controversial decision here.
I really like this fight, and I think one of the things that stands out for me is Henderson's 30 years old and Thompson's 35. And it's not just that Thompson's 35, but he is a bit injury prone. he's had multiple times throughout his career that he's had fights delayed. I mean, he was the Strikeforce lightweight champion and repeatedly had to sit on the sidelines due to leg injuries. That's actually how Gilbert Melendez became the champion in the first place. And he really hasn't gotten rid of that status that he's always had battling something. He even said most recently he didn't have a great camp. I mean, he entered the fight against Melendez in the trilogy, battling a knee injury. He ended up having to tape both knees just so Melendez didn't know which knee to target. I mean, this is a guy that has a lot of problems. He's taken a lot of damage, and his body's starting to break down a little bit. So that does scare me. But when he is healthy, I mean, he's incredibly dangerous. You saw that in the Diaz fight. He has a really high fight IQ, and he is very adaptable. He's got a lot of skills that he can mix up. I mean, in the KJ Noons fight, he didn't have a great camp, so he focused on his wrestling in that fight and got a lot of takedowns. It wasn't pretty, but he got the job done, earned his title shot. In the Diaz fight, he fought on the outside. He frustrated Diaz with a lot of movement, and then landed big head kicks when Diaz dropped his hands. So, this is a guy that can mix things up well. Thompson has a really nasty front push kick. He's got some decent power in his hands. His right head kick is solid. He throws it well, and he can mix it up well. And he's decent on the ground, but he can be controlled. I mean, you saw in the Kawajiri fight where he got, laid and prayed a little bit for the majority of the fight. You saw that in multiple times throughout his career. The Pat Healy fight, he was on his way to losing a decision before Healy gassed out and got submitted in the third round. And I mean, heck, even the Nate Diaz took him down. So that does scare me that if Benson Henderson could take him down, because Henderson does have some solid wrestling. He doesn't use it the best, but I do think Henderson has that ability to get him down if he needs to. And looking at Henderson, he trains out of the MMA lab, just 30 years old. He does have improving stand-up, and he's got that grinding, pressure-based style, constantly moving forward. You brought up the leg kicks, but he throws them a little unique. He throws them and hits the calf, so they don't just hurt you right at your base, but they can knock you off balance. So those are pretty nasty. Henderson's real strong in the clinch, likes to just push his opponents against the fence, go for takedowns. Just put a lot of pressure, and he doesn't have a lot of power, but he's constantly moving forward. Not very technical, but he is really awkward to deal with because he throws things from unique angles, and it's just a little different. So both guys do have a lot of 5-round experience, considering how many title fights they've competed in, how many main events they've competed in, so I think that's a bit of a wash. But I think that the fact that Henderson does always look to control the cage center is really important, and his pace. So I think he's going to be able to outwork Thompson, especially over the course of a 5-round fight, because we never really see Benson Henderson get tired, and he does get stronger over the course of a fight, kind of like a Demetrius Johnson. So, Reed, what do the numbers tell us here?
Well, it's a really close matchup on paper. I'm looking at these stats, and they look somewhat similar in a lot of the normal places I would look. On the tail of the tape, though, it is worth noticing that Josh Thompson's the oldest guy on the card. He's now over 35, and Henderson is a southpaw, so any normal striking trends that Thompson might have, he'll be a little bit off his game facing a southpaw. But otherwise, it's actually very even, and so I have to remind myself that when I look at Henderson's stats, I think they might be deflated a little bit due to the strength of schedule. Keep in mind, he did 2 5-rounders with Frankie Edgar, who is extremely hard to hit. He went 5 rounds with Melendez, who is another very good technical striker. I think those are depressing a little bit Henderson's accuracy. And he's not someone who necessarily is a pure striker. He's not a one-punch brawler. He's very good on the ground, and so he mixes all of that together. Some of the knockdowns he has scored were really in the Nate Diaz fight anyway, they were a little bit less important because I think Nate Diaz could see. Josh Thompson, on the other hand, his stats come out a little bit higher on the striking category, so the argument could be made that he is the superior pure striker. Unfortunately, his pace is lower, his stand-up strike ratio is lower. Henderson finds ways to outwork people and to win rounds, and having been in so many controversial decisions, it would be silly to think, oh, well, he's due to lose one close. It points out that he is very good. Judges do like his style, and he does enough on a round-by-round basis to win. So I am leaning Henderson's way here. I do see a couple mismatch stats. One of them is in the clinch. Henderson tends to control people in the clinch, whereas Thompson has generally been controlled. And then on the ground, more of a toss-up, but again, Henderson does have some advantages in terms of ground control time and his takedown defense. So again, it's very close on paper. I think I need to put it in the proper context. This probably favors Henderson, but depending on where that line goes, it could get awfully expensive to support the favorite here. So that is just a little bit of a warning. Either way, I don't see a lot of finishing potential here, so it might take the full distance to get it done. But I'm leaning Henderson. I just do think that this is a little bit closer and more competitive than the betting lines are saying.
Thanks, Reed. So that does it for our complete UFC on Fox 10 event breakdown. Make sure to check out part 2 of the Premium Oddscast soon, where we'll reveal our premium bets for the event. Those bets can only be accessed if you're a member of MMA Oddsbreaker Premium, so make sure to sign up if you want to cash in. Also, make sure to follow @Premium Oddscast on Twitter, which is where we reveal our free play for UFC on Fox 10 shortly after the weigh-ins, if we do indeed have one. You can also gain access to the free plays via our email service. Just send an email to picks@MMAOddsbreaker.com if you'd like to gain access to our list. If you'd like, you can also like our Premium Oddscast Facebook page for all the latest updates on our show. Last but not least, check out our co-host Reed Kuhn's excellent book, Fightnomics, which extensively covers mixed martial arts statistics from top to bottom. You can purchase it via paperback or Kindle on Amazon.com. Special thanks to our sponsor, 5 Dimes, and we'll see you on part 2 of the Premium Oddscast on Saturday. Good luck, and may the odds ever be in your favor.